Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip into our finest, tightest bloomers and crank the absurdity dial way past its limit. We are diving headfirst into the steamy, scandalous, and let's be honest, scientifically shaky world of Victorian medical orgasm therapy. You heard that right. There was a time when respectable ladies would line up, not for their morning coffee or the latest cosmetics, but at their doctor's office. They were there for what was delicately called a pelvic massage, and less delicately, what was probably the most awkward medical appointment in all of human history. Before we jump in, go ahead and like the video and maybe subscribe, but only if you actually like what's going on here. Leave me a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what year you think we've secretly traveled back to. Now go on and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan to get that spooky Victorian breeze going and get comfortable. You might want to pull up a blanket, hopefully not one made of that scratchy Victorian wool, because things are about to get wonderfully strange. Let's just pause for a second. Have you ever stopped to think about what it would have been like to make a doctor's appointment, not because you had a cold, but because you had a case of the vapors? Can you picture a waiting room filled with nervous women and an even more nervous doctor who probably had the worst forearm cramps in all of London? What would the reviews on Yelp have looked like? Was this kind of procedure covered by your insurance? Or did you just have to tip your doctor with a pineapple and cross your fingers? Would you have made it through a single Victorian day with a corset crushing your ribs, only to discover that the biggest relief you could find wasn't a glass of gin, but a clinical treatment for hysteria, all taking place in a room decorated in the most depressing shade of beige imaginable? Could you last even a week knowing that your neighbor's deepest secret wasn't a gambling problem, but that she had a frequent visitor card at Dr. Pearl's Parlor of Pulsations? Well, congratulations, because you've just woken up in London in the year 1884. You're a completely normal Victorian woman, except your doctor is about to prescribe something wilder than absinthe and less subtle than a telegram from your mother-in-law. Take a deep breath, because this is about to be the weirdest doctor's visit of your life, and maybe anyone's life. Good luck. Imagine yourself surrounded by the thick, relentless fog of Victorian London, where the air feels like it's made of 80% coal dust, 15% unexpressed feelings, and a solid 5% of pure, unresolved drama. Every street is a chaotic mess. Every parlor is suffocatingly stuffy. And it seems like every woman is just moments away from a full-blown case of hysteria. Which, let's face it, is just what happens when your corset, your marriage, and a diet of boiled cabbage all finally conspire against you at once. Let's really set the scene here. It's the 1880s, and you're waking up in a tall, narrow brick house on a street with a charming name like Soot Lane. The sun hasn't so much risen as it has just given up, surrendering to the gray blanket of industrial progress that hangs over the city. Outside your window, you can hear the rattle of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestones and the shouts of street vendors selling eels and cheap gin. Every now and then, You notice a mysterious puddle of some unknown liquid creeping just a little bit closer to your front door. Welcome to the city that never sleeps, mostly because it's too busy coughing to get any rest. Your first breath of the day is a mix of coal smoke, manure, and the faint smell of someone else's leftover mutton stew. You can practically taste history, and it tastes a little burnt. The walls of your bedroom are damp, tinged with that classic Victorian mildew that doctors insisted was actually good for your health. Your bed is stuffed with straw and just a little pinch of existential dread for good measure. If you feel brave enough to crack a window, you quickly discover that the fresh air is really just more fog with an attitude problem. You make your way into the parlor, being careful to avoid that one creaky floorboard that always gives away your location to everyone else in the house. This is a critical skill, since privacy in this era is about as common as a sunny day. The air inside is thick with the smell of yesterday's boiled cabbage, now being reheated for breakfast, mixed with your husband's pipe smoke, and a lingering perfume your neighbor claims is violet essence, but you know is actually just desperation and lavender water. Step outside, and the city hits you with even more sensations. Your shoes make a crunching sound on some mysterious grit. Is it ash? Is it crushed dreams? Who knows? And every time you breathe in, you're pretty sure you're developing a new respiratory illness. The fog, that famous London fog, rolls in off the Thames like a gloomy relative who just won't leave, settling into your lungs and your laundry with equal determination. The Victorians supposedly had 50 different words for fog, and all of them were synonyms for damp disappointment. If you're a woman living in this world, you have more than just the weather weighing you down. The social atmosphere is every bit as oppressive as the physical one. You are surrounded by rules. Don't laugh too loud. Don't speak unless someone speaks to you first. And whatever you do, don't show any emotion that can't be fixed with a brisk walk or a hot water bottle. If you're one of the lucky ones, you get to spend your days arranging flowers, writing thank you notes, and pretending you have no idea what gin tastes like. If you're not so lucky, you're busy wrangling children, scrubbing floors, and trying to avoid your mother-in-law's unsolicited advice about your nervous condition. And we can't forget the ever-present corset, a device so brilliantly evil it managed to restrict both your breathing and your ambitions at the same time. Every breath is a small, shallow victory against the tyranny of whalebone and tightly pulled laces. By noon, you've mastered the art of sighing without actually moving your rib cage, and you've developed a cough that's part tuberculosis, part quiet rebellion. Meanwhile, the city just keeps churning on. Doctors are writing papers on the dangers of reading novels. Journalists are writing scandalous headlines about women fainting in public. And somewhere, a group of men is seriously debating whether women's brains are smaller because of the vapors, or if it's just a case of bad luck. It's a city where every feeling, every impulse, every secret giggle is treated like a disease, bottled up, or swept under the nearest rug. By evening, the fog has seeped inside. The fire is hissing, and the only light comes from flickering gas lamps that seem as indecisive as a Victorian gentleman. You sip your watery tea and stare out at the endless gray, already preparing yourself for tomorrow. But don't you worry if the soot, the silence, or the social suffocation finally becomes too much. There's always the doctor's office. It's a place where, for a small price, you too can get a prescription that's even more mysterious than the fog itself. And that, in a nutshell, is Victorian London, a city where even the air could use a good therapist, and where just getting through the day without a case of hysteria was basically a medical miracle. In Victorian London, every woman's day was haunted by the threat of a sudden, invisible sickness. Hysteria. The name itself sounds like some kind of party trick, but it was actually the era's go-to medical explanation for just about everything. From emotional outbursts to having an opinion at the wrong time, hysteria wasn't just the most common diagnosis in town. It was practically a rite of passage. If you managed to reach adulthood without being called hysterical, then congratulations. You were either incredibly healthy, or nobody was paying any attention to you at all. Let's get into the symptoms, because hysteria had more of them than a WebMD article written by your most dramatic aunt. Feeling tired. Hysteria. Feeling moody. Hysteria. Got a headache, a stomachache, a backache, or just a heartache. You guessed it, hysteria. Did you find yourself daydreaming during a church service, getting annoyed at your brother-in-law, or spending a little too much time on your embroidery? All of that was considered strong evidence that your female organs had decided to go rogue. One prominent doctor even listed symptoms that included sudden fits of laughter, tears, fainting, nervous twitches, not being able to sleep, sleeping too much, craving sweets, having sweets, and in one especially creative case, a tendency to read novels. At this point, you'd start to think that hysteria was just a side effect of being alive. What made hysteria so useful was its power to explain everything that women weren't supposed to be or do. Feeling overwhelmed by housework. Hysteria. Wanting the right to vote. Definitely hysteria. Having trouble breathing after a long walk in a corset. Hysteria again. Never mind the fact that you were actually being slowly suffocated by your own underwear. Victorian doctors were absolutely convinced that the uterus, that mysterious organ hiding out in the pelvis, was to blame for everything. Lost your appetite. Your uterus did it. Argued with your husband. That was the uterus too. Stared out a window for a little too long. Definitely the uterus. It's important to remember that the word hysteria comes from the Greek word for womb, hystera. In other words, it was a diagnosis literally built on the belief that women were completely at the mercy of their internal organs, especially that one. Medical experts at the time imagined the uterus as some kind of mischievous animal, just roaming around inside the body and causing trouble wherever it went. In a truly impressive feat of imagination, Some of them believed it could even climb up toward the throat and choke you. A phenomenon so bizarre you almost have to admire the creativity. Forget about TikTok trends. Back in the 1880s, everyone was talking about migrating uteruses. No one was safe. Housewives, teachers, actresses, servants, even Queen Victoria herself could at any moment be swept away by a wave of hysteria. The medical journals were filled with serious case studies about women who suddenly burst into tears at the dinner table, or demanded more time for themselves, or simply wanted to go outside without someone watching over them. Every single time the cure was the same. Go see the doctor, avoid thinking too hard, and for God's sake, stop reading Jane Austen. Of course, diagnosing men was never this inventive. If a gentleman felt sad or irritable, he was just overworked or suffering from nervous exhaustion, which could be cured with a trip to the countryside, a big steak dinner, and several gallons of port. But if a woman felt sad or irritable, she was rushed off to the doctor for a thorough examination, and more often than not, a round of pelvic massage. You know, for science. Imagine the anxiety this must have created. You had to constantly be on guard, making sure you didn't appear too lively or too dull, too opinionated or too quiet. One bad day, and suddenly you were the subject of family concern, neighborhood gossip, and an emergency appointment with Dr. Percival, who kept a special bottle of lavender water just for the really difficult cases. If you cried at a funeral, you were sensitive. If you didn't cry at a funeral, you were cold and also probably hysterical. Hysteria was the ultimate Victorian loophole, a catch-all category designed to keep women quietly behaved while providing the perfect excuse for any strange behavior. So the next time you feel like calling in sick because you just can't handle another Zoom meeting, just remember, your Victorian ancestor would have had to fake an entire fainting spell, blame it on her uterus, and then hope her neighbor didn't see her reading a novel afterward. And somehow, that was still the least ridiculous part of her day. It's time for your appointment. You walk into a wood-paneled office that has a faint smell of old leather, camphor, and secrets. Sitting at the desk is your doctor, a man who is part medical professional and part reluctant spa worker, who once dreamed of curing epidemics but now spends his days treating women's hysteria with a very literal, hands-on approach. If he looks a little tired, it's because he is. He's seen more cases of female nerves than he has actual diseases, and most of them have left him with a sore wrist and a deep, existential wish for a simpler life, maybe as a beekeeper. Your doctor, let's call him Doctor Pearl, has the look of a man who's read every single page of Gray's Anatomy, but still can't find the chapter on professional dignity. He's wearing a tweed jacket, wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression that's somewhere between tired resignation and low-level panic. He offers you a seat, pours himself a cup of lukewarm tea with a trembling hand, and avoids making eye contact with a skill that tells you he's had years of practice. The Victorian physician was a walking contradiction. On one hand, he was a pillar of the community, a respected professional, an expert on all things mysterious and medical. On the other hand, he was secretly dreading his 3 o'clock appointment because he knew it meant another round of pelvic massage. This was not what he had in mind when he signed up for medical school. He wanted to fight cholera, or maybe invent a potion that would finally cure gout. Instead, he's basically providing what people today would call manual stimulation, all while trying to maintain the world's most awkward bedside manner. Imagine the tension in that room. You, the patient, are trying your best to pretend you're there for something normal, like a cough or an ingrown toenail. The doctor, meanwhile, is frantically looking over his notes on uterine congestion and wondering just how long he can put off getting down to business. He asks about your symptoms in the most vague way possible. And how are your nerves today, Mrs. Fairchild? You answer with equally vague code words. Oh, I've been feeling ever so fluttery, doctor. Both of you know exactly what's about to happen, and neither of you wants to be the one to say it out loud. There are rules to this strange dance. The doctor never, ever admits what the treatment actually is. It's all hidden behind medical jargon, relief of nervous tension, paroxysm, restoring harmony to the female constitution. If anyone were to walk in and ask what was going on, you'd both swear up and down that it was a highly technical procedure that really shouldn't be discussed in front of others. In a way, the whole appointment is a masterpiece of Victorian repression, intense physical intimacy carried out under the guise of absolute emotional distance. The doctors themselves were not immune to how absurd it all was, with some complaining in the most formal language about how time-consuming, tiring, and repetitive the treatment was. One well-known physician, Dr. George Taylor, even complained that treating hysterical women led to fatigue of the hand and wrist. Imagine coming home at night, covered in chalk dust and the heavy scent of lavender, trying to explain to your wife that your latest work injury is actually a repetitive strain from restoring the nation's nervous balance. Eventually, even the most dedicated doctors started looking for shortcuts. Some hired nurses to take over the task, which must have made for some awkward staff meetings, while others invested in newly invented vibrating devices, the mechanical massagers of their day. These new contraptions promise to reduce wrist fatigue and improve productivity, a sentence that makes everyone involved feel like they need a strong cup of tea and several years of therapy. But until then, it's just you and Doctor Pearl, trapped together in a room thick with polite embarrassment and the faint sound of a ticking clock. He wipes his brow. You stare at the ceiling. And somewhere outside, Victorian London just keeps rolling on, completely unaware of the world's most awkward medical revolution. And that's how you meet your doctor, a man who will forever be remembered for treating more nerves than diseases, and whose only real qualification is the ability to look you in the eye afterward and never, ever mention what just happened. The moment you step into the waiting room, you realize this isn't just a doctor's office. It's a social minefield. Victorian waiting rooms were less about being comfortable and more about putting on a performance. Here, every cough, every glance, every little adjustment of your hat was part of a silent game. Welcome to Anxiety Bingo, where the squares are filled with embarrassment, suppressed giggles, and the constant fear of running into someone from your husband's bridge club. The decor is classic Victorian: faded wallpaper, stiff-backed chairs, and a floral rug that has seen more secrets than a confessional booth. There's a small table with old copies of The Lady's Companion, and maybe a pamphlet on nervous complaints and their respectable cures. A thick, damp fog seeps in from under the door, bringing with it the distant sounds of carriage wheels and the promise that absolutely nothing private will ever happen in here. All around you, women of all ages sit perfectly still, pretending to be completely absorbed in their embroidery or the most boring pamphlet known to mankind. The few brave ones try to make polite conversation, which sounds something like, "Oh, how are your nerves today, Mrs.? That water. Only slightly more fluttery than last Thursday, Mrs. Griggs." The rest of the room is filled with a symphony of nervous throat clearing, the rustle of starched skirts, and the delicate clink of hairpins as someone adjusts their hat for the 10th time in 5 minutes. Privacy. Forget about it. The walls are thin. The door doesn't quite close all the way, and if you sneeze, everyone hears it and silently diagnoses you with at least 2 new conditions. You become hyper-aware of every single detail: the dust motes dancing in the sunlight, the scratch of wool on your wrist, the faint ticking of a grandfather clock that is clearly mocking you. You try not to look at the other women, but you can't help but notice their darting eyes and forced smiles. No one is here to chat. They're here for the treatment. And the less said about that, the better. What makes the waiting room truly one of a kind, though, is the tension. It's like an electric charge hanging just above the tea set. Everyone is here for the exact same reason, but everyone is pretending they're not. Each woman comes up with her own cover story. "I'm here for my migraines." "Oh, I just wanted to ask about this lingering cough." No one ever admits, "I'm here for the pelvic massage." The most you'll ever hear is a whispered reference to the nerves, delivered with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for royal funerals. The staff certainly don't help. The receptionist, let's call her Miss Primrose, moves with the solemn efficiency of a librarian in a room full of rowdy kids. She calls out names with a tone that manages to be both confidential and judgmental at the same time. When it's your turn, she raises an eyebrow just enough to make you question every single life choice that brought you to this room. If she has any idea why you're really here, she'll never say it, but she will remember. And so will everyone else. Outside the waiting room, carriages come and go, neighbors peek through their lace curtains, and the city buzzes with gossip. Inside, you play a mental game of who knows what. Does Mrs. Atwater suspect that this is your 3rd visit this month? Did you remember to tell your housemate you'd be late for dinner? Is the woman in the corner who hasn't said a word judging your boots? Or is she just counting the seconds until her own name is called? By the time you hear the doctor's door creak open, you've already lived through several lifetimes of polite panic. You stand up, smooth out your skirt, offer a tight-lipped smile to the room, and walk toward the unknown with all the dignity of a woman about to discuss nervous palpitations in great detail. Behind you, the next player in the anxiety bingo tournament gets her own nervous smile ready, clutching her purse like a shield against embarrassment. And that, my friends, is the real genius of the Victorian waiting room. Everyone is anxious, everyone is pretending not to be, and everyone is secretly hoping the doctor's appointment will cure more than just their nerves. You're led through a narrow hallway, past the peacock umbrella stand, past the potted fern with a suspicious layer of dust, until you finally arrive in the treatment room. This is where the real magic is supposed to happen, or at least where the true mechanical genius of the Victorian era makes its grand entrance. You might be expecting something out of a medical drama, with glass jars, stethoscopes, and maybe a faint smell of antiseptic. Instead, you're met with a strange display of humming contraptions, each one looking like it could either cure your hysteria or accidentally launch you into space. In the early days of medical pelvic massage, doctors had to rely on nothing more than what nature gave them: 2 hands, a firm resolve, and the ability to keep a straight face through it all. It was hard, thankless work, the kind that no medical textbook could ever really prepare you for. Dr. Pearl and his colleagues became experts in the art of not making eye contact, carefully timing each paroxysm with a level of professionalism that probably made them wish for the simple, honest work of, say, removing an ingrown toenail. But as news of the treatment got out and the waiting room started to fill up, the hands-only approach quickly became unsustainable. For one thing, doctors started to develop wrist fatigue, a workplace hazard that wasn't discussed in polite company, but was a very real concern in the more honest pages of Victorian medical journals. Desperate times called for creative solutions. And so, the golden age of mechanical intervention began. Enter the first wave of devices, engineered with all the subtlety of a steam train and the user-friendliness of a medieval torture device. Picture this: a boxy wooden contraption hand-cranked by the doctor or, for especially unlucky patients, by a nervous apprentice. It made a rhythmic chugging sound that completely drowned out any attempt at conversation and vibrated with a force that made your fillings hum. If you closed your eyes, you could almost believe you were sitting next to the engine room of the Titanic, right before everything went horribly wrong. Then came the grand debut of the Clockwork Massager, a marvel of gears, pulleys, and brass levers. It was marketed as the latest victory in the war against female nerves, and was sold to doctors' offices all across Britain, and eventually directly to the public. The advertisements promised discretion, efficiency, and the chance to restore harmony to the delicate feminine system. What they didn't mention was that winding up the device required as much upper body strength as churning butter for a family of 12. Every device had its own unique personality. Some of them rattled, some wheezed, and some let out a faint mechanical growl. The truly fancy models came with interchangeable attachments, a velvet-lined box, and a user manual written in such flowery, euphemistic language that it took 3 reads just to figure out which end was which. Victorian ladies, famous for their discretion, learned to recognize the telltale sounds: a faint whirring, a polite thumping noise coming from behind a closed parlor door. If the walls were thin, everyone on the block suddenly became very interested in playing the piano as loudly as possible. These machines were technological wonders, but they didn't solve every problem. There was always the risk of mechanical failure, which led to awkward pauses mid-appointment as the doctor fumbled with a jammed gear or an unruly spring. More than one patient went home with a story she would never tell, involving the doctor, a toolkit, and the sudden, alarming appearance of smoke. Nothing shatters the illusion of scientific authority quite like a medical device starting to belch steam in the middle of an appointment. Still, for all their quirks and their tendency to combust, these inventions completely changed the business of hysteria. Doctors could finally keep up with the demand, wrists were saved, and best of all, the treatment could now be done with a buffer of gears and gadgets, just enough distance to maintain the delicate Victorian art of denial. And so, with every turn of the crank and every clank of the gear, medical history marched onward. The tools of the trade evolved, but the underlying awkwardness remained as sturdy as the brass machines themselves. Before you even make it to the doctor's office, you have to face your first and most challenging opponent of the day, the Victorian corset. This is not just a simple piece of underwear. It's a full-body engineering problem, a triumph of human ingenuity over the basic human need to breathe. Putting it on is less like getting dressed and more like preparing for a battle where your enemy is also your best friend, and every single one of your ribs is on the line. Morning in Victorian London begins with the ritual of the corset. You stand in front of your wardrobe, armed with laces, hooks, and a silent prayer for deliverance. Your maid, if you're lucky enough to have one, comes up from behind, looking at your torso with the calculating expression of a woman who's about to truss a turkey. There's a lot of pulling. There's some swearing, silently of course. The laces are pulled tighter and tighter until your waist is supposedly the ideal 18 inches, and your lungs are roughly the size of 2 walnuts. If you can still stand up straight without fainting, it's considered a success. Now, the corset isn't just about looking good, though the fashion magazines of the time would have you believe that every woman is required to look like an hourglass with legs. It's also about discipline. A tightly laced corset makes sure you sit up straight, walk slowly, and never, ever try to do something as improper as running for a carriage. Breathing is kept shallow and dignified. Sneezing becomes a dangerous event that could send buttons flying across the room. If you drop something, it stays on the floor. Bending over is a rookie mistake. Victorian society is obsessed with appearances, and nothing signals respectability quite like the visible discomfort of a woman squeezed into her best whalebone. Your silhouette becomes a public statement. Look, everyone, I'm so proper, I can't even expand my lungs. Gossip about corsetry is almost as popular as gossip about medical treatments. Did you see Mrs. Bellamy at the market? She nearly fainted by the apples. Must have tightened to a dangerous degree. Though to have such willpower, it's suffering as a competitive sport. And yet, for all its supposed elegance, the corset is a walking health hazard. Doctors at the time published serious warnings about the compression of vital organs, displaced livers, and general nervous irritability. Of course, these warnings rarely stopped anyone. Fashion, after all, has always won out over common sense. You learn tricks to survive. You practice shallow breathing. You fan yourself constantly, and you perfect the art of leaning casually against furniture. If you look dreamy and distracted at a party, it's not because you're overcome with romantic feelings. It's because you're seeing stars from a lack of oxygen. Meals present their own set of challenges. Eating a full dinner while wearing a corset is an Olympic-level achievement. You nibble at your food, take tiny sips of wine, and hope the conversation distracts from the fact that you can only fit 3 grapes and a slice of cucumber in your compressed stomach. Dessert. Only if you plan on loosening your laces in the cloakroom, an act that is both scandalous and liberating. The phrase waist training in Victorian times meant you would never win a pie-eating contest again. And then, after a long day of not breathing and pretending you're fine, you return home and finally, you loosen the laces. The first deep breath you take is pure euphoria. Your ribs expand, your brain reboots, and for a brief, glorious moment, you feel almost human again. Until tomorrow morning, when it all starts over. So remember, before you even sit down in that waiting room, you've already survived the greatest test of all. You've made it through another day in a corset, a feat more impressive than any diagnosis, and arguably the most heroic act in all of Victorian medicine. Congratulations! You've survived the fog, the corset, and the mortifying waiting room. But now comes one of the most truly daunting challenges of the Victorian era: mastering the etiquette of awkwardness, also known as making small talk while everyone pretends nothing strange is about to happen. It's a delicate art, requiring the perfect conversational grace of a duchess and the evasive skills of a cat trying to avoid a bath. Victorian social rules were famously complicated, but nowhere did they reach such dizzying heights as in the doctor's parlor, where every interaction was laced with unspoken tension and at least 3 layers of euphemism. You couldn't just say, "Well, I'm here for my scheduled medical orgasm. Hope the doctor's had his tea." No, that would get you banned from tea parties and possibly blacklisted from the local hat shop. Instead, everyone turned to the time-honored tradition of discussing absolutely anything, except why you're all really there. If you're a regular visitor, you know the script. The conversation always starts with the weather. Always. Isn't the fog rather persistent this week? Indeed, I've never known a fog to be so enveloping. The more you can stretch out the topic, the better. You can comment on the quality of the coal, the unpredictability of April showers, or how your garden hasn't seen the sun since the Queen's last Jubilee. It doesn't matter if your conversation partner's eyes start to glaze over. At least no one is discussing the actual reason for the visit. When you've run out of things to say about the weather, you smoothly shift to health in general. Not your health, of course. That's far too direct, but the health of someone who isn't there. I hear Lady Whittington's nerves have been much improved since her trip to Bath. Yes, the waters there are simply marvelous for the constitution. No one ever mentions what happens when Lady Whittington returns to London, just in time for her next mysterious doctor's appointment. Compliments are always a safe bet, as long as you keep them inoffensive and non-committal. What a lovely brooch, Mrs. Dewey. Did you acquire it in Paris? Why, yes, but the clasp is frightfully stubborn. You get bonus points if you can keep a conversation going for 3 full minutes about fastenings, hat pins, or the advantages of different kinds of lavender sachets. The more trivial, the better. It's like a competitive sport. How long can you avoid the subject everyone is desperately trying to ignore? If you make a social mistake, a slip of the tongue, an awkward pause, a question that's a little too pointed, the rules demand an immediate, elaborate recovery. Drop your fan, spill the contents of your purse, comment on the quality of the tea, or, if absolutely necessary, fake a fainting spell. This one always works. Nothing clears a room quite like the threat of actual medical attention. Then, as quickly as you can, you pivot back to the safest possible topic, pets. Have you seen the new litter of kittens at the grocer's? So delightful. No one can object to kittens, and their presence is blessedly unrelated to the events about to unfold behind the doctor's door. Of course, there are always the truly bold souls who try to inject a little realism into the conversation. Someone, usually an elderly aunt with nothing left to lose, will murmur, "Doctors these days do keep such unusual hours," and everyone else in the room will freeze. The bravest among them will laugh politely. The rest will study the wallpaper, as if it holds the secrets of the universe. By the end of your visit, you'll have perfected the art of talking about nothing at all. You'll leave with new weather facts, a list of second-hand health tips, and the strong suspicion that everyone else knows exactly what's going on but will never admit it, even under oath or in front of the Queen herself. This, in the end, is the true etiquette of awkwardness, a shared, unbreakable pact of silence, sealed with small talk and maintained by the collective willpower of women who would rather endure 3 hours of embroidery gossip than speak the forbidden truth out loud. Welcome to Victorian conversation. Breathe shallowly and keep your secrets. Eventually, your name is called, and it's time to enter the inner sanctum, the doctor's private consulting room, which somehow manages to feel both clinical and suspiciously like a set for an amateur play. The centerpiece of this room, standing in the cold gaslight like a prop from a melodrama, is the infamous treatment table. Calling it a couch would be an insult to couches everywhere. This is less a place of comfort and more a platform for a performance, where your main role is nervous patient number one. As you get closer, you take in the details. The table is covered in oilcloth, crisp linen, or, if the doctor is particularly fancy, something that looks like velvet, now permanently dented from decades of anxious patience. There's a thin pillow, not for your head, but to make sure you don't get too comfortable. Every squeak of the legs echoes off the high ceilings, reminding you that privacy is a modern invention. You perch on the edge, your back ramrod straight, ankles crossed demurely, clutching your purse as if it contains not just a handkerchief and an emergency peppermint, but your very soul. The doctor, meanwhile, is performing his own script. He's tidying the bottles on his shelf, shuffling papers, pretending to review your case notes with intense focus. In reality, he's probably looking over a grocery list and planning the fastest escape route in case the appointment becomes too awkward. The tension is so thick you could slice it with a bone saw if one happened to be lying around. Instructions are given with military precision and the emotional warmth of a bank manager. Arms at your sides. Very good. Now relax, he says, as if you're not about to take part in the most physically and emotionally bizarre event of your adult life. You try to obey, arranging yourself on the table with the careful choreography of a woman who has rehearsed the role of composed patient far too many times. It's not just your body on this stage. Your entire identity feels like it's on display. The treatment table is an equalizer, stripping away the differences between wealthy matrons, anxious debutantes, and the occasional stoic widow. Here, everyone is just another case, reduced to their symptoms and their ability to fake nonchalance. As the doctor makes polite small talk about the price of tea, you become hyper-aware of your breathing, your posture, the way your skirts crinkle beneath you. In a society obsessed with appearances, lying on your back in a room that smells faintly of camphor and old wallpaper is an exercise in public vulnerability. And there's always the underlying absurdity of it all. For all its scientific posturing, the scene is riddled with the logic of a farce. If a neighbor could see you now, immaculately dressed, perfectly composed, lying on top of a squeaky contraption while a nervous professional prepares his therapeutic instruments, she'd either faint or demand the doctor's business card for her next fit of nerves. The gap between what is happening and what is being said is as wide as the Thames at high tide. But you are Victorian. You endure. You focus on a crack in the ceiling, a fading pattern in the wallpaper, anything to distract yourself from the awkward choreography of the treatment. You make small talk about flowers or the Queen's latest portrait. You just will the appointment to go quickly, smoothly, and anonymously, so you can gather up your dignity, smooth your skirts, and return to the waiting room with your composure as intact as possible. This is the paradox of the treatment table. Part medical device, part stage, part confession booth. No one really wants to be here. Everyone pretends otherwise, and the performance continues day after day, patient after patient. You are not just being treated, you are being witnessed. And as you rise to leave, the applause is silent, but the sense of relief is very real. Let's talk about the symptoms, the greatest hits album of Victorian medicine. In the 19th century, hysteria was the one-size-fits-all diagnosis, and its symptoms were as endless and varied as a late-night infomercial. Have a problem. Hysteria. Have no problem. Still hysteria. The Victorians could diagnose nerves in everything from a fainting fit to a love of French poetry. If you ever wondered what it feels like to have your entire personality treated like a medical condition, welcome to the ultimate medical mixtape. The list started out simply enough with the classics: sudden weeping, dramatic fainting, and the ever-popular nervous exhaustion. The Victorians loved a good faint. At the first sign of emotional distress, a woman could simply wilt into the nearest armchair, hand pressed to her brow, and be declared not just delicate, but genuinely sick. Fainting in public. Hysteria. Fainting at home. Hysteria. Fainting at the doctor's office while waiting for your treatment for fainting. That's hysteria squared. But why stop at fainting? The symptom catalog just grew from there. Headaches, insomnia, and what one doctor called a vague feeling of unrest all counted. Restless legs, shakiness, chronic sighing, and spontaneous fits of giggles made the list too. Some symptoms were so vague they could cover anything from boredom to existential dread. If you were moody before breakfast, that was hysteria. If you were cheerful after tea, also hysteria. If you could recite poetry from memory, you were dangerously close to a medical emergency. Victorian Medical Journal took pride in listing all the bizarre possibilities. Palpitations of the heart was a classic, which basically meant any heartbeat that dared to be noticed at all. A flutter in your chest after running to catch the bus. Write it down. Excessive daydreaming or letting your attention wander during a sermon. Hysteria. Loss of appetite, gain of appetite, a love of dancing, a hatred of dancing. It was all up for diagnosis. At one point, a leading physician claimed that hysteria could manifest as a tendency to take long, solitary walks, which sounds less like an illness and more like a perfectly healthy way to avoid your relatives. Then came the more creative entries. The medical literature includes things like a peculiar ringing in the ears, cold hands and feet, heat in the cheeks, and the ever-mysterious involuntary shrieks. If you startled easily, sneezed too loudly, or felt a sudden urge to rearrange the parlor furniture, you could add that to your growing list of symptoms. The simple act of reading novels was considered especially dangerous. prone to causing fits of the imagination and moral agitation. Good heavens, hide the dickens. Of course, many of these symptoms overlapped with what we might call having a bad day. Emotional volatility. Check. Feeling overwhelmed by the demands of life, lace, and relentless etiquette. Double check. Caught between the needs of your family, your own desires, and a society that thinks your uterus is plotting against you. Triple hysteria. The real trick wasn't developing symptoms, but finding a day when you didn't have at least 5 of them. But the Victorians were nothing if not thorough. There were even physical proofs of hysteria. Red eyes from weeping, pale skin from fainting, trembling hands from general anxiety. If you had a visible sign, the diagnosis was all but certain. If you didn't, that was suspicious in itself. Were you repressing your hysteria, or just waiting for a more dramatic moment to unveil it? In short, hysteria's greatest hits were just life itself, reframed as a problem that only the medical profession could solve. Every quirk, every mood swing, every ordinary feeling was transformed into a symptom. So next time you sigh too loudly or get distracted by a passing thought, just be grateful you don't live in an age when spontaneous sighing meant a trip to doctor, pearl, and a starring role on the hysteria charts. And now for the main event. You've survived the waiting room, the corset, and the world's most uncomfortable small talk. You've listed your symptoms: nervous sighing, fainting, and possibly a dangerous fondness for embroidery. There's only one thing left on the Victorian checklist: the cure. But not just any cure. This is the legendary, physician-administered, medically mandated orgasm, or as the doctor prefers to call it, the relief of nervous paroxysm. Euphemism: thy name is Victorian medicine. Let's be clear about how we got here. For centuries, the medical establishment believed that women's bodies were prone to mysterious imbalances, mostly because of wandering wombs and a surplus of emotions. The solution: restore harmony by triggering what they delicately called a hysterical paroxysm. In less scientific terms you lay on the table, the doctor applied a combination of massage and bedside manner, and after a period that varied wildly based on everyone's acting skills, the prescribed paroxysm arrived. Voila! You're no longer hysterical. At least not until next week. For everyone involved, it's a masterclass in denial. The doctor insists that this is absolutely a clinical procedure. The patient nods along, and both parties work very hard to never meet each other's gaze again in the local bakery. No one dares to call it what it is. Instead, the medical notes are full of flowery language about soothing the nerves and balancing the female constitution. It's an act of collective pretending so elaborate you'd think it deserved its own Oscar category. The experience itself. Imagine the world's most awkward spa treatment, conducted in an atmosphere of tense silence and moral confusion. Victorian etiquette demands composure at all times, So there's no enthusiastic celebration when the cure arrives. Instead, you do your best impression of a woman fainting at a poetry reading. Soft sighs, a bit of fluttering, maybe a single dignified tear. The doctor, meanwhile, reaches for his pocket watch and announces, with the seriousness of a railway conductor, that your treatment is now complete. On paper, the cure was a smashing success. Doctors confidently reported that the vast majority of their patients experienced immediate relief. In fact, many women returned again and again, bravely facing the embarrassment of the waiting room for another round of therapy. Some doctors were so popular that patients would book appointments weeks in advance, proving that apparently Victorian medicine could be habit-forming. If your neighbor seemed suspiciously cheerful after her trip to Dr. Pearl's office, you knew exactly which nerves had just been soothed. But behind the scenes, this so-called medical miracle was causing its own problems. The treatment, as you might guess, was physically exhausting for the doctor. So much so that medical journals began to fill with complaints about fatigue of the hand and wrist. Some desperate practitioners tried to pawn off the task on nurses, or, in a move that would haunt staff meetings for decades, their own wives. Others looked for mechanical shortcuts, leading to the golden age of clockwork vibrators, a story for another time, and one that involves more gears than should ever be near anyone's personal anatomy. Meanwhile, the public facade held firm. Husbands were blissfully unaware, believing their wives were receiving nerve tonics or advice about herbal teas. No one dared to break the spell, because to do so would mean admitting that pleasure, and not just medical science, had entered the room. In true Victorian style, everyone colluded in the grand farce, certain that what happened in the treatment room stayed in the treatment room, wrapped in oilcloth and plausible deniability. And so the cycle continued. The diagnosis, the symptoms, the prescribed paroxysm, and the awkward goodbyes. In a world that couldn't say the word orgasm, they prescribed it instead, one embarrassed appointment at a time. It was, for many women, the one reliable remedy Victorian medicine ever offered. For everyone else, it was a secret that would eventually shake the foundations of science, society, and polite conversation for generations to come. Let's take a step back from the flickering gaslight and ask the question you've probably been pondering since the very first treatment. Where exactly were the husbands in all of this? The answer is a tangled mess of Victorian oblivion, polite denial, and the kind of willful ignorance you can only achieve when you really don't want to know. In theory, Victorian men were the undisputed kings of their households, masters of finance, morals, and the final say on what was served for supper. In reality, there were entire continents of their wives' lives that remained stubbornly uncharted. The female body, its mysteries, and its moods were considered at best a riddle, and at worst a sort of mobile weather system. If a wife was nervous, languid, or prone to the odd fainting spell, a wise husband simply nodded and kept reading his paper. After all, the medical profession had it well in hand. Doctors were always eager to reassure their male clientele. "Sir, your wife is suffering from a touch of the nerves. Nothing unusual. We'll have her right as rain in no time." The subtext, of course, was, "Please don't ask any follow-up questions." Husbands, meanwhile, nodded gravely, expressed concern, and then, with a mixture of relief and confusion, returned to their offices, clubs, and the business of the day. If they noticed that these appointments seemed to produce a peculiar sort of post-visit cheerfulness, they chalked it up to the magic of modern medicine. Most men genuinely had no idea what happened behind the doctor's door. Victorian etiquette made it nearly impossible to discuss such matters without risking social meltdown. The boundary between men's and women's spheres was fortified by layers of custom, euphemism, and the robust application of ignorance. Husbands may have known about the existence of female complaints, but the details, off limits. In a culture where people used a lace doily to cover a piano's legs lest the sight of furniture provoke unseemly thoughts, direct conversation about the nature of medical treatments was, understandably, not encouraged. Some husbands, however, were not quite as oblivious as they appeared. There were hints, odd glances, the occasional nervous cough when Dr. Pearl's name was mentioned in conversation. If a man became suspicious, the polite thing to do was, of course, to drop the subject entirely. No one wanted to be the fellow who questioned a doctor's honor, especially not in front of company. As long as the family peace was maintained, a little mystery was not just tolerated, it was actively preferred. It's worth noting that not all men remained blissfully in the dark. A handful of curious souls, armed with medical journals and a stubborn lack of social sense, attempted to uncover the truth. They rarely got far. One look at the clinical jargon, paroxysmal relief, manual therapy for nervous afflictions, was enough to send most gentlemen scrambling back to the safety of their tobacco tins and the daily news. If anyone pressed too hard, the answer was always the same. "You wouldn't understand, dear. It's a matter for the ladies." On rare occasions, a husband might even find himself dragged to the doctor's office for a consultation, usually when his wife's symptoms had reached dramatic proportions or when his mother-in-law was in town. He'd sit awkwardly on the edge of the doctor's chair, nodding along to an incomprehensible list of nervous complaints, and leave no wiser than when he arrived, except for the growing conviction that medical science was a vast and unfathomable sea. So what did husbands know? As much as they wanted to, and as little as they dared. The real genius of the Victorian cure was not just its clinical efficiency, but the ironclad deniability it provided for everyone involved. Husbands could remain comfortably uninformed, wives could find relief, and the only casualty was the truth, which, in the world of Victorian marriage, was a small price to pay for a little peace and quiet. Let's take a moment to appreciate the remarkable intersection of Victorian prudery and Victorian inventiveness, the medical vibrator. It may sound like a punchline from a bawdy music hall act, But in reality, this device emerged from a genuine crisis in the medical profession, one that involved tired doctors, cramping wrists, and a patient list that just kept getting longer. For decades, the manual method of treating hysteria was standard practice. But as word spread and the queue in the waiting room grew, so too did the collective complaint among physicians. It was exhausting. Medical journals of the era, full of delicate phrases like fatigue of the hand, paint a picture of otherwise dignified men dreading a full day's schedule of nervous ladies in need of relief. One physician confided in a letter that an entire morning's exertions leaves the practitioner's wrist most terribly fatigued, which is possibly the most Victorian complaint ever recorded. Enter the age of innovation. If the Victorians couldn't talk about what was actually happening, they could at least invent something to make it less inconvenient. The first wave of medical vibrators arrived in the late 19th century, and they were equal parts marvel and menace. The earliest models looked like something between a sewing machine and a misunderstood kitchen appliance, bulky, loud, and utterly lacking in subtlety. Picture the scene: a doctor's office somewhere in London. The device stands on a heavy wooden table, plugged into the wall if electricity is available, or operated with a hand crank if you're off the grid. There's a chorus of whirring gears, clicking levers, and the faint, ominous scent of overheated oil. The instructions for use are so vague and euphemistic that even the doctor isn't entirely sure if he's using it correctly. But he's willing to give it a go if it means fewer trips to the apothecary for wrist salve. Despite their intimidating appearance, these machines were a hit. Doctors everywhere scrambled to purchase the latest models, often promoted in medical catalogs, alongside leech jars and mustard plasters. Ads boasted of immediate results and restorative power for the most delicate nerves, all while sidestepping any direct mention of what the device actually did. One advert even promised that the Granville's hammer, an early vibrator, could bring vital comfort and balance to the modern lady. The only thing less balanced than the modern lady was the machine itself, which had a tendency to rattle off the table if left unattended. The home market wasn't far behind. As soon as it was possible to shrink the technology and the embarrassment down to a manageable size, the personal vibrator was born. Suddenly, the promise of medical relief could be delivered from the privacy of your own boudoir. Early models required significant upper body strength to operate, and many came in discreet, velvet-lined cases with polite instructions about personal hygiene. Still, it was a revolution in self-care, even if you needed a small toolkit and an electrical engineering degree to put the thing together. Socially, the arrival of the vibrator only deepened the layers of denial. Ladies could now claim to be treating their nerves at home, while their husbands remained none the wiser. Dinner parties abounded with rumors of Mrs. Bartlett's miraculous improvement in spirits, and everyone pretended not to notice the new humming sound coming from behind her dressing room door. If anyone asked, It was simply a new muscle relaxant device. And if the topic lingered, the conversation quickly pivoted to the Queen's corgis or the weather. In the end, the vibrator became the unsung hero of Victorian medicine, a machine that turned awkward appointments into efficient business and allowed everyone to preserve their dignity, if not their plausible deniability. It was a device born of necessity, fueled by denial, and immortalized in every faint, mechanical whir echoing down the corridors of polite society. As word of the new medical marvel spread through the foggy streets and flowered parlors of Victorian society, it was only a matter of time before the humble vibrator made the leap from the doctor's office to the home. What began as a desperate bid to save doctors' wrists became a golden opportunity for early marketing and a new era of household self-care, delivered straight to your doorstep in a velvet-lined box. Home medical devices were nothing new to the Victorians, who already adored gadgets. They embraced everything from foot baths to electrostatic combs, and the more complicated, the better. There was a device for every ailment: bad posture, liver torpor, melancholia, and even the common sighing fits. So when the personal massager appeared in the pages of catalogs and on the shelves of apothecaries, it arrived with impeccable credentials. Here was the solution to nervous exhaustion, female malaise, and that most distressing feminine complaint, all without ever mentioning the word orgasm. The advertising was a master class in Victorian euphemism. Pamphlets and posters described the devices as muscle relaxants, personal rejuvenators, and appliances for the restoration of harmony to the nerves. Drawings showed well-dressed women reclining gracefully beside boxy machines that looked like steampunk espresso makers. The language was full of phrases like gentle vibration for immediate relief, brings healthful energy to all parts, and soothes agitation in the delicate system. Not a single raised eyebrow in sight. The illustrations were equally discreet. A typical advert might show a matron, cheeks slightly flushed, gazing serenely into the distance as she pressed a suspiciously shaped apparatus to her wrist, her temples, or, most implausibly, at her shoulder. No one was pictured in a state of undress, and if the machine was accidentally shown near the waist, an artfully draped ribbon or an entire tea service would block the view. Still, the message was clear to those in the know. Middle-class and affluent women who had suffered the indignities of the waiting room were suddenly empowered to bring the treatment home. No more awkward appointments, no more sidelong glances from Mrs. Atwater at the doctor's office. Just the privacy of one's own sitting room, and a new device that promised to revitalize without ever spelling out how. Word spread in that uniquely Victorian way, slowly, quietly, and with just enough plausible deniability for everyone to pretend they didn't know what everyone else was doing. Letters between sisters contained cryptic mentions of marvelous improvements and sleeping so much better these days. Daughters dropped hints to their mothers, who in turn shared tips on winding the crank or keeping the motor oiled. No one dared speak openly, But suddenly, the local apothecary's stock of personal massagers vanished as quickly as the sherry at a family reunion. Husbands, as ever, remained charmingly oblivious. If they noticed a sudden upswing in their wives' energy, they chalked it up to the latest tonic or an invigorating stroll. The sound of faint whirring from upstairs was politely ignored, and the only risk was that an overzealous maid might try to dust the machine and ask too many questions. When cornered, the official explanation was always that it helped with the circulation, a phrase so broad and bland it could excuse almost anything. As time went on, the devices themselves improved. Smaller, quieter, and mercifully less likely to burst into flames, they became a staple of discreet domestic life. The personal massager, once a medical curiosity, settled comfortably into the Victorian arsenal of household health, just another tool for the modern woman battling the endless foe of nerves. And so, the marketing genius of the Victorian era achieved what polite society never could: universal access to pleasure, cloaked in the language of science and wrapped in a ribbon of utter, unwavering denial. The home device was here to stay, proof that in the right hands, even a medical crisis could become a must-have accessory. If Victorian London had a favorite sport, other than trying not to faint in a corset, it was gossip. And nowhere was gossip more deliciously potent than in the parlor, that hallowed ground where secrets, speculation, and scandal swirled with the steam from the afternoon tea. Within these chintz-draped walls, the topic of hysteria treatment hovered like a mischievous ghost. Everyone knew, no one admitted, and plausible deniability was served on silver trays right alongside the scones. The beauty of parlor gossip was in its choreography. Ladies gathered, ostensibly to discuss literature, charity events, or the pressing matter of Mrs. Henley's begonias, but beneath the polite surface, the real action simmered. With a strategic flick of a fan or a knowing glance over the rim of a teacup, one could communicate more than a medical textbook ever dared. It only took a casual remark, "Mrs. Atwater does look awfully radiant lately," to send a ripple of suppressed snickers around the room. Everyone had their own way of hinting without saying. "My doctor, Pearl's practice seems busier than ever," might be met with a chorus of innocently raised eyebrows. Indeed, there's always a queue down the street. Such a comfort to know he's so dedicated to women's health. If someone pressed the issue, the subject could instantly pivot to the weather or the alarming shortage of quality marmalade, as if no one had ever heard of a medical device, let alone owned three. The unwritten rule was simple. As long as you didn't say it out loud, you could know absolutely everything. Parlor talk was a high-wire act, a daily test of how much you could imply without tripping over the line into outright confession. It was a social contract everyone honored, especially because everyone benefited. For those who'd already visited the doctor or acquired a personal rejuvenator, for the home, the game was one of subtle boasting. For those still awaiting their appointment, it was an exercise in nervous anticipation and meticulous note-taking. Occasionally, someone would push their luck. The resident troublemaker, there was always one, might murmur, "Well, my husband prefers I visit doctor. Paravel at least once a week, just to keep my spirits up." Cue a wave of half-concealed smiles and a stifled cough from the vicar's wife. But the spell was never truly broken. Propriety demanded the game continue. The scandal lived in the unsaid, thriving in the space between what was obvious and what was politely ignored. Servants, of course, knew everything. The parlor door might be closed, but ears were always pressed to the keyhole. The cook passed notes to the scullery maid, who whispered to the laundress, who then casually mentioned to the grocer that Mrs. Bartlett's nerves are very improved these days, thanks to Dr. Paravel. News traveled through kitchens and cobblestone alleys faster than any telegram. If you ever doubted the power of domestic intelligence, just try hiding a new purchase from the housemaid. She'll know before you do. The ripple effect reached husbands, who might catch a stray comment or a giggle over supper, but rarely pressed the issue. In their own clubs, men might joke about women's mysteries, but never in a way that risked actual understanding. It was safer and frankly more dignified to leave such matters to the ladies. And so, parlor gossip performed its essential function, keeping the community informed, amused, and forever dancing around the forbidden topic. Hysteria treatment remained the worst-kept secret in town, protected by tradition and a refusal to name things directly. It's said that nothing in Victorian England was ever truly private, only politely unspoken. And nowhere was this art of selective silence more perfectly displayed than in the parlor, where every cup of tea was steeped in innuendo, every compliment a coded signal, and every, "Oh, I'm feeling much better, thank you," was met with a chorus of silent, satisfied knowing. While the doctor's office was doing a brisk business in paroxysmal relief, not every Victorian woman with a case of nerves found herself reclining on Dr. Paravel's infamous oilcloth. Victorian medicine, after all, was a smorgasbord of wild improvisation, folk traditions, and outright guesswork. For every woman booking a medical appointment, there were 3 others attempting to solve their problems at home, usually with remedies that ranged from questionable to outright hilarious. Let's start with the classics, leeches and bleeding. For centuries, it was believed that all bodily problems, from headaches to heartbreak, could be solved by the strategic application of a slippery bloodsucker. Hysteria. Why not pop a leech just below the ear and hope for the best? Leeches, after all, were nature's multitaskers, good for everything, guaranteed to ruin your pillowcases, and always willing to lend a helping suck. If that didn't do the trick, a quick round of bloodletting with your local barber surgeon might. One shudders to think how many cases of nervous distress were actually just cases of being 2 pints short of a picnic. If bleeding didn't appeal, perhaps you'd try the herbal route. The Victorians were obsessed with teas, tinctures, and tonics, all brewed from a bewildering variety of roots, leaves, and suspicious powders. The pharmacy shelves were stocked with valerian for nerves, laudanum for sleep, and dandelion for whatever ailed you. Laudanum, a delightful blend of opium and alcohol, was the era's answer to, well, everything. Feeling tense? 2 teaspoons, and you'd forget you had a nervous system at all. The danger, of course, was waking up 3 days later with a vague recollection of having solved all your problems, but none of your laundry. Then there were the water cures, hydrotherapy for the ambitious. If you suffered from hysteria, some advised a series of cold plunges, brisk showers, or hours spent swaddled in wet sheets. The thinking was simple. If your body was shocked enough, your nerves might give up in protest. Hydrotherapy clinics offered rooms filled with tubs, spigots, and a staff determined to keep you damp at all costs. Women emerged looking refreshed, albeit slightly pruned, and reported feeling invigorated, which is Victorian for surprised to still be alive. Of course, not all remedies involved risk of hypothermia or narcotic stupor. Sometimes the solution was simply to get out of the house. A brisk walk in the park, a ride in an open carriage, or an afternoon spent tending the roses were all thought to chase away nervous energy. There was something almost revolutionary about a woman striding through the city on her own, arms swinging, head high, her problems left somewhere among the pigeons and cabbages. Physical movement, laughter, and socializing were unofficial cures, often prescribed by mothers, sisters, or the family friend who read too many French novels. And then there were the more experimental approaches. Some women sought out mesmerists, who claimed to calm the nerves with little more than a stern gaze and some dramatic hand gestures. Others visited phrenologists, who promised to massage the hysteria right out of the right bump on your skull. Spiritualists, meanwhile, would gladly conduct a seance to communicate with your nerves directly, though success rates were mixed, especially if the spirits were otherwise engaged. For the truly desperate, there was always laughter. Satirical magazines and novels poked fun at the fashion for nervous complaints, and a good belly laugh among friends could be more effective than a week of wet sheet wrappings. If you could find humor in your predicament, you were halfway to being cured. In the end, every woman cobbled together her own prescription. A little leech here, a dash of laudanum there, a brisk walk, a cup of valerian tea, and if all else failed, an appointment with Dr. Pearl. The quest for relief was a grand Victorian adventure, with no shortage of bizarre stops along the way. If nothing else, at least the journey was never dull, and occasionally it was even a little bit fun. It's easy to picture Victorian doctors as confident, mustachioed masters of their domain, dispensing diagnoses, managing fainting fits, and ushering the anxious and afflicted through the fog of London. But behind the walnut desks and layers of professional detachment, many a Victorian physician nursed a secret sense of despair. Not only did he have to navigate the ever-growing world of female complaints, but thanks to the hysteria epidemic, he also faced a more literal and immediate problem: wrist fatigue. On paper, treating hysteria was a matter of restoring balance to the female constitution. In practice, it meant hour upon hour of manual therapy, an activity so repetitive and exhausting that it soon became the bane of the busy practitioner. Medical journals, usually reserved for lofty debates about laudanum dosage or the merits of leech placement, began to fill with wry complaints about aching hands and numb fingers. If you wanted to spot the hysteria specialist at a medical conference, you just had to look for the man rotating his wrists and wincing at the tea service. There was, of course, a professional pride to maintain. The Victorian doctor was not supposed to admit that any part of the body, least of all the wrist, could get tired from a day's work. But reality had other plans. Letters between colleagues included phrases like extraordinary muscular exertion, daily strain upon the practitioner, and in one memorable case, the persistent terror of seeing one's own appointment book fill up with nervous ladies by the hour. The sheer volume of hysteria patients grew so great that many doctors began to delegate the work. Some, in a move that would alarm modern HR departments, quietly assigned their wives or nurses to take over the task. Others sought mechanical relief, investing in the latest vibratory devices with all the hopeful enthusiasm of a man who's just bought a self-winding watch. Yet even these marvels came with their own set of challenges, namely, making sure they didn't catch fire, seize up mid-procedure, or send the wrong message to the housemaid. For all the complaints about wrist fatigue, there was another, deeper level of existential dread. Victorian doctors, after all, had set out to cure diseases, not to become unwitting protagonists in the most awkward farce of the era. Instead of pursuing breakthroughs in surgery or chemistry, many found themselves mired in the endlessly awkward business of paroxysm induction, forever trapped between scientific progress and the demands of social denial. To admit what was really happening was to risk reputation, career, and perhaps an invitation to the next Royal Society dinner. Some doctors tried to bring a sense of order to the madness by codifying procedures, writing treatises on the proper method, and insisting that the treatment was entirely clinical. But even the most determined practitioner could not ignore the growing suspicion that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to women's nerves than met the eye, and that all the wrist action in the world wasn't addressing the underlying problem. In the end, the Victorian doctor became an unlikely symbol of the age, well-intentioned, slightly bewildered, and doing his best to keep up with a world that was changing faster than his own appointment book. He carried on with a stiff upper lip, a sore lower wrist, and a fervent hope that one day medical science would invent a better solution, ideally, one that required less stamina and far less plausible deniability. And so, while Victorian women queued for their appointments, their doctors queued for wrist braces, new gadgets, and occasionally, a quiet moment to question all their life choices. If you're hopping for a neat, scientific explanation behind the Victorian hysteria craze, brace yourself for disappointment and maybe a fainting couch. The science of hysteria was a masterclass in guesswork, wishful thinking, and the enduring power of a well-groomed mustache. For every treatise, diagram, or earnest medical illustration, there was roughly the same amount of actual knowledge as you'd find in the average cup of laudanum. Victorian medicine was a curious blend of ancient superstition and the latest discoveries. For hysteria, doctors looked first to the Greeks, who believed the uterus could wander around the body like a bored house cat, causing chaos wherever it roamed. Fast forward to 1880, and not much had changed, except now the explanations had fancier vocabulary and a great deal more paperwork. The basic theory was that women, by virtue of their mysterious internal plumbing, were uniquely vulnerable to nervous disorders, emotional outbursts, hysteria, difficulty sleeping, hysteria, an inconvenient desire to think for yourself, hysteria with a side of impertinence. Medical textbooks were crammed with descriptions of nervous excitability and delicate constitutions, but not a shred of genuine scientific evidence. No one could prove what hysteria was, but everyone agreed that something had to be done about it, preferably in the form of a well-billed office visit. Even the official symptoms list was a marvel of vagueness. Women could be diagnosed for anything from crying too much to laughing at the wrong time, or even just walking in circles. Doctors, desperate for solutions, prescribed everything from rest cures and cold baths to, inevitably, the infamous manual therapy. The more enthusiastic practitioners would wave around electrical diagrams and swear by the power of a mild shock, even if it left their patients with nothing but tingling toes and new material for parlor gossip. Victorian scientists prided themselves on experimentation, but the studies on hysteria were less rigorous inquiry and more polite guessing. One doctor claimed that hysteria was caused by an overactive imagination. Another insisted it was a lack of appropriate social outlets. Some blamed education, reading novels, or simply thinking too hard. If your nerves weren't jangled by the smog, your corset, and the state of public transportation, they would surely be rattled by the sight of a woman with a library card. And then there were the remedies, each more dubious than the last. Leeches, cold compresses, tonics, and vibratory massage were all endorsed with the unwavering confidence of a man who'd never experienced any of them firsthand. If a treatment didn't work, that was simply proof that the patient was unusually difficult, and a new regimen was in order. The science was as flexible as a Victorian etiquette manual, always ready to adapt, so long as no one questioned the fundamental assumptions. Yet, despite its profound lack of evidence, the science of hysteria endured for decades. It persisted because it was useful, explaining away the mysteries of womanhood and keeping everyone, especially women, neatly within their expected roles. If a woman questioned her diagnosis, well, that was further proof she was hysterical. Circular reasoning was the only thing spinning faster than the latest medical device. In the end, the science of hysteria tells us more about Victorian anxieties than it does about actual biology. It was a diagnosis built on shadows and superstition, cloaked in the language of progress. So next time you see a beautifully illustrated 19th century anatomy chart, just remember, it's probably about as scientifically sound as the average seance, and twice as likely to end in awkward silence. There's nothing quite like a market opportunity to get Victorian inventors out of bed in the morning. Once word spread that doctors were developing wrist pain and women were queuing down the block for their regular hysteria treatments, the most ambitious minds in Britain snapped to attention. If there was one thing the era excelled at, besides euphemism and elaborate hats, it was patenting devices that promised to solve problems most people weren't even supposed to talk about. The race to invent the perfect hysteria cure was on. Suddenly, medical supply catalogs were bursting with diagrams of new devices, each more complicated than the last. The first entries were modest: hand-cranked massagers and spring-loaded percussion tools, all designed to transfer the heavy lifting from Dr. Pearl's aching wrists to the miracle of clockwork engineering. Some devices looked suspiciously like overzealous egg beaters, while others resembled the kind of steampunk weaponry you'd expect to see in a Jules Verne novel. Competition among inventors was fierce. Each one sought to outdo the last by adding more gears, more attachments, and most impressively, more promises. Restores feminine harmony. It relieves all manner of nervous exhaustion. So gentle, you'll barely notice the noise. The latter was only true if you lived next to a blacksmith or had already lost most of your hearing to the family piano. The patent office, once a sleepy backwater for umbrella improvements and better mousetraps, found itself awash in blueprints for female rejuvenators and mechanical nerve regulators. The clerks tasked with reviewing these inventions developed an entirely new vocabulary of professional neutrality. One can only imagine the awkward silences during office tea breaks. Another vibrating apparatus, Jenkins. Just put it on the pile, Smedley, and no questions, please. Some inventors aimed for sheer spectacle. There were foot-powered contraptions for the hands-free enthusiast, devices fueled by compressed air, and in at least one unforgettable case, a machine so large it required its own corner of the drawing room and the steady hand of a retired blacksmith to operate. Advertising illustrations delicately depicted well-dressed ladies in faintly theatrical poses, always looking serenely off into the middle distance, never at the device in question. Not to be outdone, American inventors got in on the action, sending their own health appliances across the Atlantic. International rivalry spurred even wilder designs. A few entrepreneurial souls tried to combine the vibrator with other household items, leading to a brief, chaotic period where the most popular parlor chairs and sewing machines came with suspiciously powerful attachments. One enterprising inventor even proposed a device that would fit discreetly beneath a breakfast tray, turning morning tea into a multi-sensory experience best left unmentioned at the supper table. For all the spectacle, not every device was a triumph. There were disasters, motors that overheated, springs that snapped, and inventions that left more bruises than relief. Some products vanished from the market almost as quickly as they appeared, surviving only as cautionary tales shared among nervous physicians and the occasional gossipy parlor maid. Yet for every failed experiment, another invention would take its place, slightly smaller, slightly quieter, slightly less likely to destroy your lace tablecloth. And so, from the parlor to the patent office, Victorian innovation ran wild, fueled by equal parts necessity and denial. The world had never seen such a creative, and creative at dodging the truth, market for medical devices. In the end, these wild inventions did more than just ease the burden of doctors. They fueled a quiet revolution, turning a medical embarrassment into an industry and giving Victorian women, for the first time, a taste of the power of technology in the privacy of their own homes. For all the awkwardness, denial, and heavy-handed marketing, something quietly radical was happening. As hysteria treatments moved from the doctor's office to the home, Victorian women began to take control. The age of the personal medical device wasn't just about convenience or sparing doctors from carpal tunnel. It was a revolution in privacy, agency, and, dare we say it, pleasure. Picture the scene. A respectable woman in a neat London terrace house, drawing the curtains for her afternoon rest. Gone was the mortifying wait in doctor. Perival's reception room, the fraught small talk, and the forced smiles at the neighbors who definitely recognized your bonnet. Now, relief could be found in the sanctuary of your own bedroom or boudoir, free from prying eyes and raised eyebrows. If anyone knocked, you were simply lying down with a touch of the nerves, a phrase so vague and overused that it became as invisible as the sound of the city's ever-present fog. Manufacturers, sensing an opportunity, rebranded their products with ever more delicate names: health restorers, vibratory massage aids, electromechanical nerve soothers. The velvet-lined boxes slipped discreetly into wardrobes and under beds, while instruction booklets were read, reread, and then hidden in the sewing basket. For once, women didn't need a prescription, a chaperone, or a doctor's approval to address their own needs. The home treatment revolution had begun, and with it, a subtle but seismic shift in power. Social rules still loomed, of course, even in private. Victorian etiquette was a force to be reckoned with. No one would ever discuss their treatments directly, and the possibility of being discovered was enough to make anyone bolt upright at the sound of a maid's footstep. But within these boundaries, women found ways to share advice, tips, and the occasional borrowed device, always wrapped in an extra layer of discretion. Letters between sisters became cryptic missives about the marvelous improvement in my health and the device you recommended. What a blessing. Mothers slipped coded advice to daughters, and friends developed a sort of Morse code for discussing their latest remedies. It wasn't just about physical relief, though that was reason enough to keep the patent office busy. There was a deeper sense of autonomy at work. For many, the arrival of a home device was the first time they'd had control over a part of their own well-being. In a world where women's bodies were often discussed, diagnosed, and decided upon by men, this was no small thing. The living room might still belong to the family, the street to the city, but the private retreat, the bedroom, was quietly, fiercely reclaimed. The change didn't go unnoticed. Servants exchanged meaningful glances and tidied certain nightstands with suspiciously gentle care. Husbands might wonder why their wives' spirits had lifted, or why their nervous attacks had become so regular and so brief. No one dared ask too many questions. The secret, such as it was, became an open one. In hindsight, the great home treatment revolution was a precursor to much more than just technological progress. It foreshadowed the long, slow journey toward greater independence and agency for women, a history not of headlines and declarations, but of 1,000 small victories behind closed doors. Each carefully hidden device, each quiet afternoon spent resting, was a step toward ownership of health, body, and time. So the next time you see a velvet-lined box at an antique market, remember, inside might be the story of a Victorian woman who decided, for once, to write her own prescription. No doctor required. Just as the home treatment revolution was reaching its genteel, velvet-lined peak, the 20th century arrived, dragging with it a wave of new ideas and one Austrian man with a mustache so serious it could curdle cream. Enter Sigmund Freud, the thinker whose very name now conjures images of couches, cigars, and awkward silences. Freud didn't just upend the world of medicine. He also changed the fate of hysteria treatments forever, leaving doctors, inventors, and device makers blinking in the cold light of psychoanalysis. Freud looked at the Victorian diagnosis of hysteria, and with all the confidence of a man who had never worn a corset, declared, "It's not your uterus, it's your unconscious." Suddenly, all those lists of symptoms, all those patent applications, all those hours of paroxysm induction were swept away by a new narrative. The root of women's nervousness, sadness, and emotional outbursts was not a wandering womb, but a tangled mass of repressed memories, forbidden desires, and unresolved father issues. This idea was both liberating and a little terrifying, especially if you just invested in the latest spring-loaded health restorer. Freud's new approach didn't involve cranks, clockwork, or wrist fatigue. Instead, it offered the talking cure, a revolutionary concept that involved lying on a couch and speaking freely about your childhood, dreams, and disappointments, while a very serious man took notes and refrained from making eye contact. Victorian doctors who had spent years perfecting their mechanical techniques found themselves outflanked by a generation of psychoanalysts with impressive beards and even more impressive vocabularies. Almost overnight, hysteria as a medical diagnosis fell out of fashion. No longer would fainting spells, mysterious giggles, or even a passionate dislike for boiled mutton earn you a prescription for paroxysmal relief. Instead, women were invited to discuss their feelings, examine their motives, and, if necessary, confront the fact that they simply lived in a world that didn't want them to have too much fun. Freud's theories filtered through salons, universities, and eventually the pages of women's magazines, until even the most determined doctor had to accept that the game had changed. Device manufacturers weren't happy, of course. Suddenly, muscle relaxers and nerve regulators were out. Introspection and dream analysis were in. The velvet-lined box industry took a blow, and there were some truly tragic moments as dusty rejuvenators were quietly retired to attics and sewing baskets. Husbands were, as always, slightly behind the times, still cheerfully oblivious and blaming their wives' improved moods on the weather, the garden, or just a good night's sleep. Yet the end of hysteria as a clinical condition marked something greater than a change in shopping habits. For the first time, society acknowledged that women's emotions, anxieties, and even desires might have roots deeper than mysterious humors and mischievous organs. There was, at last, the faint glimmer of a world where women could be understood as people with inner lives, complicated, fascinating, and sometimes gloriously resistant to diagnosis. And so, hysteria's reign fizzled, leaving behind only the echo of clockwork, the faint scent of camphor, and 1,000 velvet boxes hidden beneath 1,000 beds. Freud, for all his odd ideas and controversial legacy, had sounded the bell for a new era, one in which the conversation would shift from the doctor's hands to the patient's mind. And for those who missed the old ways, well, let's just say antique dealers have never lacked for strange and mysterious contraption from the golden age of nervous complaints. If you'd attended a girls' school in Victorian England, your education would have covered many things. French verbs, the art of polite conversation, how to embroider a very small bird onto a very large handkerchief. What you would not have learned, under any circumstances, was anything remotely useful about your own body. The official curriculum was a triumph of evasion, designed to produce accomplished ladies who could waltz, curtsy, and faint decorously on command, but not, heaven forbid, know what their organs actually did. Science lessons for girls were rare and vague. You might get a lecture on the wonders of the animal kingdom, followed by a hasty diagram of a frog. Human biology, if addressed at all, was shrouded in euphemism. The most daring textbook might reference the female constitution, a phrase so impenetrable it could mean anything from the heart to a passing mood. Reproductive anatomy was out of bounds, reserved for whispered warnings from mothers, cryptic comments from older sisters, or the helpful pamphlet that explained absolutely nothing except that you should always keep your ankles covered. Sex education, as we know it, simply did not exist. Instead, young women were expected to navigate a bewildering world of hints, half-truths, and the occasional cautionary tale about what happened to girls who read too many French novels or stood near the wrong kind of statue. If you had questions, you were encouraged to suppress them. If you didn't, the general hope was that you'd eventually forget. Actual information arrived only after marriage, and sometimes not even then. The consequences were predictably comic and occasionally tragic. Brides entered their wedding nights with a sense of vague foreboding, armed with a trousseau of linen, a box of lavender sachets, and not a single practical fact. Many a Victorian woman described her first real knowledge of how things worked as a cross between a surprise party and a minor medical emergency. If you were lucky, you had a well-informed friend to explain things over tea. If not, you made do with alarming guesses and the ever-popular method of waiting to see what happens. Mothers, when pressed, sometimes resorted to elaborate metaphors. Darling, when a man and a woman love each other very much, the stork brings a baby. And you must always be sure to drink your tonic and never, ever sit on cold stone. This was generally considered sufficient, if not especially enlightening. Questions beyond this point risked attracting the dreaded accusation of impropriety, a fate worse than ignorance. Meanwhile, the boys' schools fared little better. Their own lessons were just as light on facts, though they did cover the essential topics of cricket, Latin, and why one should avoid certain neighborhoods after dark. Actual biology, and certainly anything involving women, was best left to the professionals or ignored until it became impossible to do so. The real curriculum, the one every woman learned sooner or later, was the unwritten code passed down in whispers and sideways glances. It involved decoding advertisements, interpreting the meaning behind a neighbor's new purchase, and understanding the secret language of nervous ailments. Sometimes it meant exchanging tips on operating household devices. Other times, just knowing when to nod, smile, and change the subject. So, if you find yourself wishing you'd learned more in school, take heart. Your Victorian ancestors felt the same way. Their education was a masterpiece of polite avoidance, a syllabus written in ellipses and finished in the margins. The most important lessons, the ones about agency, pleasure, and self-care, were never taught in any classroom. But somehow, the smartest women learned them anyway. Beneath the surface of polite society, behind the layers of petticoats and protocol, a hidden world of honest confession flourished. Inside the pages of Victorian women's diaries and private letters. Here at last the truth could be whispered in ink, the nervous energy, the midnight anxieties, and yes, the peculiar relief found on the doctor's treatment couch or with the help of a certain velvet-lined appliance. If parlor talk was an endless dance of euphemism, the diary was where the music stopped and candor took a bow. The written confessions of Victorian women are an extraordinary record of life in a society obsessed with keeping secrets. In letters to trusted friends and scribbled journal entries, women documented their bewilderment, frustration, and often their amusement at the medical advice they received. Saw the doctor today who prescribed a new tonic and, oh, the indignity, another round of massage. I do wonder if my health or his patience will expire first. There was comfort in being able to joke about the absurdity, at least in the safety of one's own handwriting. For many, the diary was a lifeline. It became the place to vent about everything that could not be discussed aloud. The boredom of endless rain, the suffocation of the corset, and the latest oddity in Mrs. Atwater's window box. When it came to hysteria treatments, the tone could shift from weary resignation to sly humor. I am convinced the doctor's hand will fall off before my nerves are ever soothed, wrote one woman. But at least Mother seems satisfied by my new cheerfulness. Sometimes, these private writings reveal a level of self-awareness and agency that the medical world never acknowledged. Women question the very premise of their diagnosis. Is it possible that all women are hysterical, or merely those whose husbands prefer the club to conversation? Some pondered the social convenience of being able to call a bad mood a nervous complaint, while others treated their appointments as a necessary, if baffling, ritual, just another item on the weekly calendar, alongside laundry and soup. There were confessions, too, about the odd empowerment found in navigating the system. If nothing else, I have learned to book my appointments for Tuesday, when Mrs. DeWay is least likely to be in the waiting room. Some even described moments of genuine relief, both physical and psychological, that made all the awkwardness worthwhile. The diaries became a quiet record of women discovering, little by little, the right to their own experiences, even if those experiences had to remain shrouded in secrecy. Letters between close friends, often burned after reading, could be more candid still. These missives swapped advice about which doctors had the best bedside manner, which devices were least likely to catch fire, and how to distract inquisitive husbands or nosy maids. Your suggestion about the new electromechanical model was most helpful. One letter might read. I shall send you the address by separate post. Burn this. Historians today treasure these rare glimpses into the private lives of Victorian women. While the medical literature insisted on silence and obedience, the secret diaries reveal wit, skepticism, and a persistent yearning for something more than a diagnosis. They are filled with a longing for relief, for understanding, for a life less bounded by absurdity. So next time you imagine Victorian women as humorless victims of their time, remember the private pages where laughter, complaint, and confessions flourished. Far from the watchful eyes of society, the real truth about hysteria isn't in the textbooks. It's in the secret diaries hidden under the mattress, and in the margins of a life that refused to be entirely written by someone else. It was only a matter of time before the polite silence surrounding hysteria treatments cracked wide open. In a city where gossip could move faster than the fog, all it took was one loose-lipped housemaid, one misplaced instruction manual, or one overzealous inventor eager for publicity. And suddenly, London's tabloids had the juiciest story since the time the Prince Regent fell off his horse at Ascot. The headline writers could barely contain themselves. Medical marvel or morality menace. The shocking secrets of the parlor device. As with all proper Victorian scandals, it began quietly. Someone, perhaps a former patient with an axe to grind, or an ambitious journalist with a taste for melodrama, started asking pointed questions about what exactly happened behind the closed doors of certain fashionable doctors' offices. Medical devices with names like Health Restorer and Electromagnetic Harmonizer began to attract more than the usual level of interest. Within days, rumors about the real purpose of these machines leaped from back alley whispers to the front pages of every penny dreadful and society rag in town. The stories were predictably a riot. Illustrations showed shocked matrons swooning away from suspiciously vibrating contraptions, while cartoons lampooned befuddled doctors and blushing patients. Some papers went for high drama, wives in ecstasy. The treatment London can't stop whispering about. Others preferred scandalized disbelief. Ladies line up for medical outrage. Letters to the editor poured in from anxious husbands, indignant churchmen, and the occasional bored baroness who claimed to have known all along. Society responded in classic fashion: public horror, private fascination, and a sudden surge in sales of anything marketed as for nerves only. Some families quietly hid their home devices in cupboards and coal bins. Others doubled down, insisting their regular appointments with doctor. Parallel were for nothing more shocking than a stubborn case of lumbago. Parties buzzed with coded conversations as everyone tried to figure out which of their neighbors' improved spirits were courtesy of a vibrating miracle, and which were merely the result of a new recipe for Madeira cake. For the doctors, the scandal was a nightmare and an opportunity. Some issued stiff, legalistic statements about the highest medical principles. A few quietly closed their practices for a rest cure of their own. Meanwhile, clever inventors seized the moment, producing devices with even more innocuous names: the invigorator, the rejuvenation engine, all while giving the packaging an extra layer of plausible deniability. The tabloid storm even swept through the genteel world of high society. There were rumors of titled ladies caught red-handed, of a duchess's housemaid selling stories to the press, and of a prominent physician who left London altogether, only to set up a booming practice in Paris. For a few weeks, you couldn't attend a dinner party without overhearing some daring guest joke about the importance of regular electrical maintenance, and watching the entire table collapse into giggles. Eventually, as all scandals do, this one faded, replaced by the next moral panic, the next royal mishap, the next mysterious illness blamed on bad air and low morals. But the effect lingered. The parlor device became both a symbol of forbidden modernity and a punchline for amateur comedians. For some, it was a source of new caution. For others, a point of pride. The Great Victorian Hysteria scandal was proof that even in a society built on repression, the truth always finds a way to the surface, sometimes with a headline, sometimes with a wink, and sometimes with a quietly humming motor hidden behind a perfectly respectable closed door. Take a moment right now to look around your room. Maybe you've got a cup of coffee within arm's reach, a soft blanket, a phone that knows more about you than your own diary ever will. You're breathing air that, with any luck, is not 60% coal smoke and 30% other people's nervous exhaustion. In this soft-lit comfort, you might find yourself wondering, how would you, a thoroughly modern person, fare if you were suddenly thrown back into the wild, weird world of Victorian medicine? Let's be honest, most of us would last about 6 minutes. First, you'd be hit by the smell: damp wool, boiled cabbage, and that mysterious Victorian fog that never seems to leave your lungs. Your doctor, whose medical expertise ranges from leeches to laudanum, would greet your sniffles with a mixture of concern and experimental curiosity. A slight cough. That calls for a mustard plaster, 3 spoonfuls of cod liver oil, and possibly a brisk walk to clear the humors. You'd politely decline, only to find yourself being bundled into a horse-drawn cab and delivered to doctor. Pearl for a consultation that, no matter what your complaint, ends in the recommendation of paroxysmal relief. Would you handle the infamous waiting room, the silent glances, the coded conversation about nerves, and the fact that you're surrounded by women pretending to read pamphlets that might as well be blank? Could you endure the corset, the oilcloth treatment table, and the omnipresent threat of being prescribed a leech for your Instagram addiction? If you managed to get through the appointment itself, would you then bravely head home, wind up your velvet-lined medical marvel, and hope the maid doesn't come in while you're soothing your system? Or would you, like many Victorians, simply pour yourself another cup of weak tea, stare into the middle distance, and wonder if perhaps you've been misdiagnosed with congestion of the liver, when you really just need a nap? Modern life isn't always perfect. Your inbox can fill up faster than a Victorian parlor after a scandal, but it's hard not to appreciate how much easier things have become. Today, your medical devices are designed for privacy. Your health advice is only a Google search away, and nobody expects you to sit quietly while a stranger prescribes you a nerve tonic made mostly of alcohol and hope. And yet, there's something strangely admirable about our Victorian ancestors. They endured a daily onslaught of discomforts and indignities, icy bedrooms, cryptic diagnoses, and more euphemisms than a polite society dinner. They kept straight faces in the waiting room, learned to interpret every sideways glance, and somehow managed to keep secrets while living 10 feet from their in-laws. The tools were clunky, the science questionable, and the cures a roll of the dice. But still, they persevered, sometimes with a sense of humor, sometimes with a faintly vibrating box hidden under the bed. So would you survive Victorian medicine? Technically, yes, if you could laugh at the absurdity, nod along to the coded language, and keep your sense of curiosity alive, even when faced with a prescription for gentle vibration. Most of all, you'd need the stubborn hope that things could eventually get better. Tonight, as you curl up in your own world of comfort and clean sheets, send a little gratitude back through time. After all, you're the beneficiary of generations who endured questionable science, survived relentless small talk, and always found a way to keep their secrets and their dignity mostly intact. As the long night of Victorian medicine finally drew to a close, humanity collectively sighed, perhaps for the first time with fully expanded lungs. The age of leeches, laudanum, and the politely humming health restorer was over. For all its velvet, brass, and relentless euphemism, the medical orgy of the 19th century had finally given way to modernity. And if anyone knew how to be grateful for progress, it was those who had survived a treatment with Dr. Pearl. Let's take stock for a moment. Indoor plumbing is not just a luxury, but a human right. Your waiting room is now a digital queue that lets you scroll cat memes instead of nodding awkwardly at misses. At water. If your nerves are frayed, you don't have to fake a faint or endure a brisk walk through a rainstorm. You can, with a few taps, schedule an actual therapy session, order food, or find a soothing playlist without once resorting to a velvet-lined box and plausible deniability. Modern medicine, for all its flaws and insurance forms, rarely recommends a device that could double as a bread maker or set your petticoat on fire. Your doctor will listen, make eye contact, and in the very worst case, suggest yoga instead of a mechanical paroxysm. You can get a prescription for actual medicine, one that's been tested, peer-reviewed, and will not require you to feign ignorance at family gatherings. Most importantly, you can talk about your health. You can ask questions. You can expect honest answers, no matter how embarrassing, complicated, or surprisingly modern your problem may be. And let's be clear, as much as we poke fun at the Victorians, their awkward journey did serve a purpose. It forced society to confront the reality of women's bodies, health, and pleasure, even if it had to do so with 1,000 layers of metaphor and denial. The parade of nervous ailments and muscle relaxers was ridiculous, yes, but it marked the start of conversations that would echo for generations. Every time a Victorian housemaid gossiped about the latest miracle device, she paved the way, awkwardly and anonymously, for a future where women could speak up for themselves and about themselves. Still, let's not get too nostalgic. It's easy to romanticize the era of candlelight and carriages until you remember the reality. Soot on every surface, fainting from tight corsets, and the constant risk that your next treatment would involve being both mortified and electrocuted. Every advance in science, every improvement in social norms, is a little gift from the past, a whispered promise that things really can change, even if it takes 100 years, a few scandals, and several patent offices full of ticking brass monstrosities. So tonight, as you slip under clean covers and dim your electric lamp, give a silent nod to science. Be grateful for doctors who ask more than, "How are your nerves?" and for medicines that don't involve animal magnetism, marital awkwardness, or a trip to the blacksmith. History is often strange, sometimes hilarious and frequently horrifying. But its true legacy is survival, and the quiet hope that tomorrow, the world will make just a little more sense. And if you're ever tempted to wish for the good old days, just remember, the best invention of the Victorian era might be the one we left behind. sleep well and dream of progress. You emerge from doctor, Pearl's consulting room with your hat slightly askew, cheeks flushed, and an indefinable lightness in your step. The experience was officially for your nerves, but you can't help feeling as if you've been let in on a secret that's both scandalous and oddly refreshing. This is the legendary post-treatment glow, the Victorian equivalent of walking out of a modern-day spa, except the treatments are less cucumber water, more plausible deniability. In an age when actual self-care was unheard of, when bubble baths were suspicious, and taking a nap was an act of radical defiance, Victorian women seized what little rejuvenation they could get. The relief after a medical paroxysm wasn't just physical. It was emotional, social, and perhaps most importantly, subversive. After weeks of obeying etiquette, repressing complaints, and squeezing into a corset designed by someone with a grudge against ribs, you had finally found a way to feel good. And no one could stop you. But the real magic of the post-treatment glow wasn't the glow itself. It was what you did with it. Victorian society required a constant performance of composure. If you felt lighter, calmer, or even, heaven forbid, joyful, you had to express it only in the most coded ways. Perhaps you took a longer stroll in the garden, pausing to admire the hydrangeas with a serenity that made the housemaid raise an eyebrow. Maybe you sang a little louder during afternoon piano practice, or responded to your husband's tedious remarks with an unusual degree of patience. The art of subtlety was key. A touch more color in the cheeks, a trace more kindness in your voice, and always the insistent, polite denial that anything at all was different. Women became experts in this coded self-care. A cryptic note in a diary, feeling much improved after my appointment, could mean anything or everything. Letters to friends across town were loaded with sly references to the tonic that doctor, Paravel prescribed, or a new method of relaxation. You'd exchange recipes for fruit preserves in public, but everyone knew which fruit was actually in season. The post-treatment glow, then, became a signal, hidden yet universally understood by those in the know. Men, of course, were largely oblivious. Husbands would return home to find their wives in suspiciously good spirits, and, reassured by a warm meal and pleasant conversation, would chalk it up to the restorative powers of roast mutton, or perhaps the weather. Your glow might last a few days or fade by the next round of laundry, but for that brief time, you were your own secret society of women who, for a moment, put themselves first, if only in the smallest, safest way possible. The post-treatment glow was also contagious. Others noticed and wanted the recipe, even if they'd never admit it outright. An epidemic of improved moods swept through tea parties and church pews, prompting more appointments, more coded gossip, and the slow, quiet realization that perhaps a woman's well-being was something to be taken seriously, if only in whispers. So, as you adjust your hat and step back into the sooty London afternoon, remember this. Your secret is safe, your spirit a little lighter, and your story now part of a long tradition of quietly rebellious self-care. In a world determined to keep you proper, the real luxury is claiming joy for yourself, even if you have to call it treatment. In the whirlwind of Victorian social life, every minute was spoken for. There were charity luncheons, embroidery circles, poetry readings, and the ever-important daily ritual of tea. Squeezing in a medical appointment for one's nerves required the organizational skills of a general planning a campaign. This was the era when booking a doctor's visit wasn't just about health. It was about strategic calendar management, social camouflage, and the high art of plausible excuses. Let's be clear, you could not simply announce to your family or friends, "I'll be late for tea, I have a pelvic massage at 3." Victorian society demanded layers of euphemism. So appointments were slotted in between acceptable activities. "I'm visiting Mrs. Farnsworth to discuss the flower show," or "I have business at the apothecary," or the classic, "The doctor wishes to check on my constitution." With enough confidence, any errand could become a medical cover story. Timing was everything. An early appointment risked running into Mrs. Griggs, who arrived promptly at 9 and was known for her indiscreet tongue. A midday slot meant missing luncheon, which could be suspicious, and the post-luncheon hour clashed with the embroidery society. Most preferred late afternoon, conveniently just before or after tea. This allowed for a seamless re-entry into the social world, with flushed cheeks and improved spirits chalked up to the invigorating walk or the delight of Mrs. Atwater's lemon scones. Tea time itself was a strategic hub, part social exchange, part intelligence briefing. Gossip moved at lightning speed between the cups and cakes. Who was seen near Dr. Pearl's surgery? Whose carriage was parked outside during visiting hours? What exactly was in that little velvet pouch Mrs. Bartlett always carried? Everyone was an amateur detective, parsing invitations and absences for coded meaning. If someone looked especially radiant at tea, it was only polite to compliment their new hat and never, ever inquire too closely about their day's itinerary. Of course, there were hazards. Overlapping appointments were a social disaster. Imagine arriving at the doctor's office only to find half your embroidery circle lined up in the waiting room. In such cases, women became masters of improvisation, suddenly deciding they had the wrong day, feigning a lost handkerchief, or inventing a sick relative to explain their hasty exit. Nothing shattered the illusion of discretion faster than a scheduling error. Managing the home front required just as much finesse. Children needed to be packed off to lessons, husbands distracted by business, and housemaids carefully briefed, or more often left entirely in the dark. For some, the solution was an intricate, color-coded diary hidden behind the gardening manual. For others, it was a trusted friend who could cover for any unexplained absence. In letters and diaries, women mapped their weeks with military precision. Tuesday, call on Mrs. Atwater. Wednesday, fitting at the dressmaker. Thursday, doctor. Friday, rest with cake. Each appointment was a carefully planned maneuver in the larger campaign of daily life, ensuring health and reputation both remained intact. If all went according to plan, you would arrive at tea a little brighter, a little more relaxed and perfectly composed. The conversation would drift from recipes to the latest novel, pausing only to note that the weather seemed to agree with you lately. And as you poured another cup, the real story remained unspoken, a victory for scheduling, secrecy, and the unbreakable tradition of English tea. So next time you struggle to fit self-care into your modern calendar, spare a thought for your Victorian predecessors. Their schedules were a battlefield, their excuses legendary, and their tea absolutely non-negotiable. In the finely balanced dance of Victorian high society, few skills were more valuable or more frequently exercised than the art of the creative excuse. For the Victorian woman, keeping up appearances required a daily performance worthy of the West End, and nowhere was this more apparent than when concealing a visit to doctor. Pearl for the infamous treatment. With reputations hanging in the balance, a well-crafted alibi was as essential as a clean handkerchief or a matching set of gloves. Excuses had to be crafted with precision, delivered with sincerity, and above all, adapted to their audience. To your mother-in-law, you might sigh, "Oh, my headaches have been so persistent." The doctor says I must avoid excitement and get plenty of rest. For the local vicar, nothing beat a reference to the female constitution, vague, unimpeachable, and guaranteed to end the conversation. Your friends received more elaborate stories, a sudden need for a new bonnet ribbon, a fitting at the dressmaker, a trip to the apothecary. The more details, the better, as long as you didn't overplay your hand. No one wanted to be the subject of next week's tea table speculation. Timing was everything. Your absence from the garden party could be explained by a last-minute invitation to help arrange flowers at the charity fete. If you missed a luncheon, it was surely due to the dreadful weather or an urgent letter from a distant cousin. But the gold standard of excuses was the dental appointment, universally dreaded, rarely questioned, and conveniently vague about the real nature of the procedure. After all, who would press for details about an aching molar? Some women elevated the art to near-legendary status. Mrs. Atwater, for instance, was a master of layered excuses. She would claim to have a headache, then add that she was on her way to the stationer's to collect her new monogrammed note cards, but only after she stopped by the fishmonger's to pick up the freshest cod for supper. By the time she'd finished, any nosy inquirer would be so exhausted by her itinerary that they'd forget what they'd asked in the first place. The stakes were high. In a society where rumors could circle the neighborhood faster than the milkman, being caught out in a lie was a fate worse than a week's worth of cold compresses. Thus, every excuse was supported by tangible evidence. A fresh parcel from the haberdasher's, a polite note from the dentist, even the faintest whiff of lavender water left in your wake. Friends covered for one another, offering to corroborate stories or swap errands as needed. The solidarity of women, when properly organized, was a force to be reckoned with. Yet in all this subterfuge, there was often a twinkle of amusement, a secret joke shared by those in the know. Women prided themselves on their ability to weave a convincing tale. A particularly clever alibi could be discussed in code at tea, its effectiveness measured by the number of raised eyebrows or suppressed giggles it inspired. Beneath the surface, the endless cycle of excuses was about much more than protecting reputations. It was about carving out a little freedom in a world that constantly pressed in, a small act of self-determination wrapped in silk and good manners. The daily lie became a way to claim space for oneself, if only for an hour. So next time you consider feigning a dentist appointment to escape an awkward meeting, remember you're part of a long, proud tradition. The anatomy of a lie is as old as high society itself. And in Victorian London, it was not just an art, it was a survival skill. If you ever wanted a case study in selective awareness, look no further than the average Victorian husband. While their wives juggled corsets, calendars, and covert medical devices, the menfolk floated serenely above it all, secure in the conviction that everything at home was exactly as it should be. For these gentlemen, ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was practically a requirement for marital harmony. Husbands, after all, had their own spheres to worry about: the city, the club, the increasingly complicated business of growing an acceptable mustache. Domestic affairs were best left to the women, whose mysterious nerves and female complaints were spoken of with reverence and confusion in equal measure. If a wife seemed tired, the solution was simple: recommend a rest, perhaps a trip to the seaside, and trust that doctor. Pearl would handle whatever mysterious ailment afflicted her. If the matter was more urgent, a husband might escort his wife to the doctor's office and wait in the hall, hat in hand, silently reciting investment figures while muffled voices drifted through the closed door. He never asked about details. Questions about women's health were perilous ground, best avoided in the name of good breeding. Besides, the doctor's instructions were usually delivered in the most reassuringly vague terms possible: plenty of rest, nutritious food, and regular visits for therapeutic intervention. What could be more respectable? For those who did take an interest, the explanations were dense with jargon. Medical journals, if read at all, spoke of hysteria, uterine congestion, and the delicate balance of humors. A husband might nod gravely at such wisdom, privately relieved he had chosen law over medicine. Some even prided themselves on their knowledge of their wife's schedule: Thursdays, bridge club; Fridays, nerves. What went on during those hours was a mystery wrapped in a comfortingly familiar routine. Of course, there were hints: the sound of a whirring motor from upstairs, a wife's sudden improvement in mood, or the sight of a mysterious velvet-lined box delivered by the apothecary. Still, the best course of action was to notice nothing. If pressed, a husband could always fall back on plausible deniability. "Oh, my wife. She's quite well, thank you. Just a touch of the nerves. The doctor assures me it's nothing to worry about." This wasn't to say that men were oblivious to everything. Some took pride in their wife's new cheerfulness, believing it the result of their own careful management or the invigorating effect of Sunday walks in the park. If their wife's appointments became more frequent, they might recommend an extra helping of broth or a weekend at the coast. Their confidence in their own prescriptions was as unshakable as their confusion about what actually went on in the parlor. A few, of course, harbored suspicions, the occasional raised eyebrow, the odd question left hanging in the air. But Victorian etiquette demanded that such uncertainties remain unspoken. After all, nothing could disrupt domestic tranquility faster than too much information. The unspoken agreement between husband and wife was simple. She would tend to her nerves, he would tend to his ledgers, and both would meet at supper with the peace of those who know not to ask too many questions. So when you hear tales of blissfully ignorant Victorian men, remember, their ignorance was not just luck, but a carefully curated shield against the more complicated truths of marriage. In a world built on euphemism and denial, ignorance really was marital bliss. And perhaps in some ways it still is. By the end of the Victorian hysteria epidemic, secrecy had become its own form of public theater. The city's parlor rooms and cobblestone streets buzzed with whispers and knowing glances. It was the classic, not-so-secret secret. Everyone knew what was going on behind the closed doors of Dr. Pearl's practice and inside velvet-lined boxes at home, but no one dared say it outright. Victorian society was united not by ignorance, but by an elaborate, unspoken agreement to keep up appearances, no matter how comically thin the disguise. This shared denial was a feat of communal choreography. The women exchanged subtle nods at church and winks over the tea table. The men, meanwhile, would make pointed comments about the importance of rest and a good female constitution, all while carefully not noticing the frequency of Mrs. Bartlett's visits to the apothecary. The local apothecary himself, suddenly a dealer in gadgets and vague advice, nodded sagely at every request for a nervous tonic, never once asking what exactly needed to be soothed. Servants, ever observant, traded stories below stairs about mysterious packages and muffled whirring sounds from upstairs. Housemaids polished strange brass contraptions with practiced indifference. Cooks discussed which houses seemed cheerful these days. And the butler at number 12 was said to time the afternoon post with uncanny accuracy. In the city's gossip network, discretion was the rule, not the exception. Even the medical profession played along. Dr. Pearl, the world's least enthusiastic masseur, maintained a clinical demeanor while knowing full well why his waiting room was so popular. New patients were welcomed with the same polite smile and vague promises of relief. Notes in patient files used only the safest language. Anxious disposition, prone to nervous spells, responds well to regular sessions. Everyone acted as if the rituals were both absolutely necessary and totally ordinary. In letters, diaries, and secret conversations, the truth peeked through. Friends hinted about their wonderful new remedy, or the machine that made all the difference. Daughters learned from mothers how to book discreet appointments, and sisters swapped coded advice about which brand was least likely to overheat. All the while, society itself was built on a mountain of polite lies and cheerful avoidance. There was comfort in the pretense. As long as no one spoke the truth out loud, everyone could claim innocence, respectability, and a certain air of moral superiority. It was a social contract as sturdy as any law, enforced not by the police, but by a mutual desire to keep things uncomplicated. The woman who blurted out the truth at tea was branded a scandal monger, while the one who changed the subject was welcomed as the true lady. In this world, reputation depended on one's ability to keep a straight face while everyone else winked behind their teacups. The not-so-secret secret became a kind of safety net. Women could pursue their own comfort. Husbands could maintain plausible deniability, and everyone else could enjoy the steady thrum of society with its rituals and routines intact. The alternative, outright honesty, was simply too destabilizing for a world that prized decorum above all. So, as the last gaslights flickered over London and the city settled in for another night, the secret that everyone knew but never admitted remained quietly safe. Behind every closed door, in every respectable household, life continued with a blend of quiet rebellion and careful pretense. And so Victorian society thrived, not despite its secrets, but because of them, weaving the fabric of an era with silence, wit, and just the faintest sound of clockwork behind a bedroom door. So tonight, as you settle in, free from corsets, clockwork contraptions, and the ever-present risk of being prescribed a pelvic massage by a man with a handlebar mustache, take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come. Victorian women queued up for medical treatments in a world where their emotions were symptoms, and their pleasure was a secret best kept behind a velvet curtain. They endured more than just the absurdities of bad science. They survived a daily gauntlet of social expectation, rigid gender roles, and an endless supply of cabbage soup. But still, they persevered layer by laced-up layer, laugh by stifled laugh, appointment by awkward appointment. Every whispered conversation, every carefully scheduled doctor's visit, every hand-cranked device hidden in a dresser drawer is a reminder that people, especially women, have always found creative ways to reclaim a little bit of control, even when the world insisted they were simply hysterical. So as you tuck yourself in, maybe with a heating pad that won't set your sheets on fire or a cup of tea that won't be confiscated by your doctor, remember, history is bizarre, humans are resourceful, and suffering together is oddly hilarious. Be grateful for modern medicine, actual science, and a society that, most of the time, lets you take care of yourself in peace. And as you drift off, smile for all those ancestors who endured awkward appointments and even more awkward explanations, who laughed quietly in waiting rooms and found their own secret joys, even when the world tried to diagnose them out of existence. Sleep well. History is over for now. No waiting room required.